So David's staying for the panel discussion, and I'd now like to invite back Amanda and Enrico for the panel discussion. And we have three new guests. So joining us today is Bruce Goodwin. He's held management roles for the last 11 years, including 2 terms in his current role of the Managing Director of Janssen Australia and New Zealand. I'd also like to welcome Kirsten Pilatti. She's the CEO of Breast Cancer Network, and she has an exceptional understanding of the Cancer Centre, having spent a decade at BCNA and 5 years at the Cancer Council Victoria. And our last panel guest is Dr. Michael Dickinson. He's the lead of the Aggressive Lymphoma Disease Group at the Peter McCallum Cancer Centre and the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and he specialises in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials of new anti-cancer drugs with a focus on aggressive lymphoma and novel immunotherapies. Welcome, everybody. Now, if you have a question for the panel, please send them in now. We'll start with a general question. What are the priorities we need to focus on now so we can have the cancer system in 2030 that better meets the needs of all patients? We might start with you first, Kirsten, if you can answer.
Thanks, Sophie, and thank you all so much for being here. I hope that as the leader of Breast Cancer Network, help to bring much of our learning so that other people don't have to make some of the mistakes we have over our 21 years. But for me, this absolutely has to be led by the consumer experience. And, you know, I think whenever I say patient-centred in any kind of document, I think it's a bit like saying the CEO has the open door policy, but the door's closed. So we need to really make a difference in making sure that we are delivering patient-centred care, and that's about involving patients from the very beginning, not because we need to tick a box for a research application at the last minute, but actually all of us being at the table from the very beginning. And what you will find is that many patients can give fantastic solutions that sometimes those people in the system are just too entrenched in the system to really look at practical and easy solutions for it.
And Michael, I might get you to reflect on the same question as well. What's your view?
Well, I just been listening to David's talk. I think genomics are really important, and personalised medicine is very important. I also think we've seen a lot of these new immunotherapies come through. What I've learned over the last couple of years is that there needs to be a little bit of speculation and a little bit of a loss leader type approach, being willing to bend on new technology and try using it a bit before you necessarily demonstrate that it has value. Because what I've learned is that by using these new genomic tools and trying these new therapies, we're more likely to have our patients participating in trials, and we're able to build the workforce, the complicated workforce that is required to actually take this out to the broader community, so that we go from hearing about some discovery to actually implementing it in the community is going to take, I guess, the loss leader, taking a bet to be prepared to invest, and just by practicing to use these technologies, build a workforce that can then take it to the broad community. And I think some of the themes that have come through from the Rare Cancers Australia are about focusing on telehealth and other clever ways to get the opinions out, and is a way of taking these technologies much more broadly than having to have people go into a specialised centre. I think that's important too.
Thank you very much. And Amanda, we might just stick with our Melbourne guests at the moment and get you to answer the same question about what are the priorities we need to focus on now.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, I'm really encouraged by Michael's response, because it's really where the gap lies and where we foresee there will be issues in the future with our current systems, in that provision of early access to really cutting-edge therapeutics when the evidence is being generated. We can't afford to wait, as Richard said, for fundamental proof of cost effectiveness in the traditional ways that we have before. And we're not saying that we want to throw those principles out. They've worked for us in the past. But what we want to do is not delay access, evaluate cost effectiveness comparatively when it makes sense to do so, and generate evidence along the way, and use that real world evidence when we have the breadth of the evidence to do these meaningful evaluations. But patients need to trial the therapy when they're available.
So we've got a couple of audio issues from our Melbourne guests. We might try to address that and just ask a few questions to our Sydney audience. We might start with Bruce. What do you think the industry's role will be in delivering on the framework outlined in this report?
Well, I think first and foremost you have the industry brings a role because they're actually bringing the new technologies, the new treatments forward, and of course doing that as quickly as possible is what we're all focused on. But I think it's been referred to a number of times in this forum already. There's sometimes difficulties with the pace that new technologies are coming through the system. And that's because we're looking at things in a particular way that we've been doing for probably more than 20 years.
So having a growth mindset is very important.
Absolutely it is, yeah.
So you spent several years as CEO of Janssen in Japan. Can you explain to the audience how their system works and what are the potential lessons for Australia?
Yeah, well, I think when I went to Japan in 2012, the first thing was a pleasant surprise that if a new product is registered by the regulatory body, there is, within 60 days, a reimbursement decision made. And even when there's a dilemma about it, it goes no longer than 90 days. Now,
that must be great relief for patients knowing that and doctors knowing they don't have to wait a long time to get an answer.
I think it's a great ambition, isn't it, for to have that kind of time frame. I think in Pillar 6 we're looking at how do we accelerate part of it, but that could be a great ambition, right, to be looking at a much shorter time frame. And if we pull back and have the right policy discussions with all stakeholders at the table, I do think those types of things are achievable.
So another question that's come in from the audience says that there are subsidies for drugs for common cancers but not for rare cancers, and by definition you can't get to the evidence base if it is a rare cancer, but the problems remain the same. So I might ask David, how do we overcome that, the fact that given you have fewer people with the cancer, you may never get that base of evidence that you would need for a subsidy?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be recognition that holding rare diseases to an impossible standard is getting nobody anywhere. The second thing is that even common cancers are actually becoming rare. So it's not a problem which is ever going to remain confined to a certain set of individuals. So it's a problem that's fundamental to the nature of science, I think. We're understanding more, things are becoming more precisely defined. And the regulators in the US and also in Australia are increasingly accepting what is called single-arm data rather than randomized data. Often the effect sizes are so great when you pick a patient who's got the right target and connect it to the right drug that you don't need 300 patients to prove the point. You can see it as a bleeding obvious in 50 patients. And there's been perhaps a dozen different regulatory approvals in the US based around single-arm data. So I think finally, pan-cancer approvals are obviously, could be potentially transformative, where a drug clearly has an effect across many different cancer types that share a certain biomarker, then why discriminate whether it's rare or common? If you've got the cancer, why not have a go? I would also say that I think this is the principle about why research is so critical to standard of care. Because if we don't have research in standard of care, we never accept the idea that there is some uncertainty. We have to accept some uncertainty so that patients get access through research, which is clearly directly beneficial, while we resolve that uncertainty. So that's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about research being a standard of care in the future.
So David mentioned the pan-cancer tumour, and this is something that's been very important to Rare Cancers Australia. Maybe Amanda, can I just get you to pick up on that point and explain for the audience who might not know what that is, the idea of getting a cancer drug approved across a number of cancers rather than for one particular cancer. Can you just explain that to the audience?
Yeah, you just summed it up nicely. So agree. The pan-cancer treatment for pan-cancer is a treatment that is a targeted therapy that can treat multiple cancers, and all those cancers share the similar target. We've actually recently had the first pan-cancer therapy TGA approved in Australia, and it's a Bayer drug, and we're wondering, therapy, I'm using drug, but we're wondering, how are we going to navigate the MSAC pathway to get the testing approved? There's two tests. One could be, I think it's FISH test, and the other one is potentially using next generation sequencing, which is the faster test that we talked about earlier today. And obviously the second test is much more beneficial. So there are going to be complications along the way, so we will need to look at our systems to address that. Pan-cancer is a really exciting field, and the reason why it's exciting is because traditionally our approach to approving medicines and therapies for cancer has been indication by indication. So that means, you may have a very specific type of breast cancer and a very defined patient population that is eligible for a particular treatment, and yet somebody else who has a different form of cancer could equally benefit, but the clinical trial evidence isn't available, so those patients simply miss out. So what pan-cancer therapies do, it means that you're getting to a much broader reach much more quickly, and that the targeted therapies are likely to be effective because they are targeted, as Dave described earlier.
And Bruce, just on this issue of the pan-cancer therapies, what's the pharmaceutical industry's point of view of that type of treatment and that type of approach?
Well, I think a number of companies already experimenting with pan-cancer treatment. So I think very keen to see that technology being realised.
And Michael, what about you? What with the pan-cancer approach? What's your view of that and how useful that could be for helping a broader variety of patients who might have a rare cancer in particular?
Well, I think there's a tension between targeted treatments, because we've heard about genomic testing to find a targeted treatment for a new target within say a common cancer, and David referred to the example of colorectal cancer, and we have examples in lymphoma where you have a common disease category and then you try to refine exactly what the cancer is and then pick the exact drug for that. The pan-cancer approach is kind of sort of a little different. It's where you have a drug that might apply to a particular mechanism of action that might be present across several cancers. So I think that it has a lot of potential. I think it's part of the answer. I don't think it's the whole answer. I think that there are certain classes of drug where a pan-cancer approach is really appealing, and I think that we'll see that there needs to be an intersection between that targeted approach and recognising that a mechanism of action can occur in several different cancers, and then learning a bit about which cancers these pan-cancer drugs work best in. And I think perhaps the most sort of recent example of a single drug working across multiple different disease groups are these checkpoint inhibitors, these immune checkpoint inhibitors, where one drug might be really, really active in lymphoma and really, really active in melanoma, but that doesn't mean it's really active across all cancers. And working out what the biomarkers are that predict responsiveness to these promising treatments is still a work in progress, and I think it's going to require the sorts of tools that David's developing and the sort of very consistent application of those tools to enable us to work out how those drugs should be applied. But there are clearly some very good examples of these pan-cancer type approvals and approaches, and I think thinking outside the box is something that regulators need to be doing.
Thank you. Now, we had a question that might be a good one for David and maybe Enrico as well, which is about the audience member has said, I like Chris's vision, which is actually, I think, a quote from the report, about promoting equity and access. How can we promote equity and access at the same time reconcile that with the high cost of these innovative new medicines? So how do we reconcile that? Maybe David and maybe Bruce and Enrico as well?
Well, for me, Sophie, I think equity of access means equity of access, a right to try. I think we heard this expression earlier. I love the idea of a right to try. I think science is reason's version of hope, if you like. And through clinical trials and science, all of us are striving towards a better future. And it's a partnership with industry as well, so all of us operating together. I think, as I've said before, every patient facing a crisis of this kind should have access to trials, because through those trials we believe there's a chance of a better future, not only in the distant future, but actually for that patient right now. So for me, it's about expanding clinical trials activity from around 7%, which is what it is currently, to something much better than that.
So there's that only 7% of potential patients would take part in a clinical trial?
In the adult sector, about 7% of adult cancer patients get onto clinical trials. Interestingly, pediatric cancer, the Zero Childhood Cancer Program, the advances in pediatric cancer have been massive, just absolutely incredible over the past 40 years. And it's partly because their trials participation rates vary from about 40% up through 80 or 90% in certain centres. That shows if you take part in research, you accelerate progress. So for me, it's about, and I think the key point that I was making about genomic testing is if genomic testing is fundamental to finding the patients who will benefit from going on trials, then the key, the bottleneck, the single weak point that we need to get at is universal access to genomic screening. Once that happens, then game's on.
Fantastic. And we might just stick with this, the question about the issue of equity of access versus expense. So Bruce, how do we reconcile that?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't refer to new treatments as high-cost treatments. I'd call them high-value treatments, and we have a system here that does assess quite rigorously the affordability of new treatments as they come through. And it is it's like anything else in the public domain. It's a trade-off decision about how much money should be allocated into this part of the community versus what we do. And I think that's where we've got to have a policy discussion. You know, what does the public want and what would they like to trade off? But I think there is a lot of value in recognising innovation maybe a little differently to what we do today.
Okay, I might go to Kirsten to ask you that question in terms of equity of access. How do we reconcile that, potential disconnect between wanting equity of access but also recognising that it costs a lot of money to develop these treatments and make them available?
The VCCC had Eric Weiner come out from America last year and just before the pandemic, and he said every new drug is currently costing $150,000. And that's one of the challenges we need to deal with. But equity is a very big issue. We did a State of the Nation report in 2018 of more than 30,000 Australian women and men who had breast cancer. And the equity to clinical trials for regional patients, but also the equity of regional patients being able to access good GPs, good health professionals at the time that they need is something we have to deal with from a health systems perspective. So I think it is absolutely everyone coming to the table and to the point that we must build a system that can be much more flexible and agile than we currently have. And that means significant policy change in the way that we deliver healthcare, but also the way that we're all working together, PBAC, MSAC, TGA. We really are pretty slow moving. And so if we want to see this Vision 2030, equity has to be the key to our measurement of good outcomes, because we know the further you live away from a metro centre, the worse your outcomes are from a cancer perspective. And that must be our ultimate goal, is to deal with the equity.
And so if we want to get the cost of medications down, maybe Enrico, I might go to you. What role will AI have in making it ideally less expensive to develop these amazing new drugs?
So it's an interesting challenge, because in some ways we are investing an awful lot, let's say, in digital health and electronic health records, and we're not extracting the value that's already there. So it is a policy challenge in this country that it's not possible even within a state to connect all the patient records in a uniform way, let alone nationally be able to create a pooled resource of electronic health records, which we can use in what's called an interoperable way. That's not a technical problem. That's just a lack of, I guess, leadership at the COAG level to make that happen.
While we've got you, we've had a question from James. And he's asking, how do we resolve the fears around the misuse of data collection and AI in the general public?
So this is a really difficult and important question, and I guess I can give examples of where it's gone wrong. And going back to the English NHS, the NHS has essentially sold patient data from the health system to large companies like DeepMind and Google, really without social license. So they've done these things without checking that the population is comfortable with the use of their health data in this way. So this has to be, and we've said this before, a conversation between consumers and patients and providers, or in this case government, about how things should go forward. I can't imagine that we can do the things we want to do with the 2030 vision without accessing data and in fact making it available not just to researchers but to the big companies who are hugely invested in the technologies. But the governance has got to be right, and as I said, we have to have social license around that. So it's a difficult and important conversation.
Because I think if people feel comfortable that the governance is right, particularly I've noticed with COVID that people are more willing to hand over information. You know, we're all putting our emails in and phone numbers wherever we go now. So if people think it's for a common good, they'll be willing to hand it over. But you do need to make sure that those governance structures are in place, don't you? So you can feel comfortable.
And COVID's a great example because the first app that was launched had a lot of anxiety amongst the population about being tracked by government. But when it was clear, in fact, that the government had done the right thing, that the app actually was not tracing you in the way people imagined, people's trust returned. But trust has to be earned, and I've got to say, it can be quickly lost.
So we've got another question, which we might go to from Tracy from Perth. And she's asking, how can we better support our adolescents and young people to navigate the adult system with late effects and multidisciplinary care? Maybe that might be a question for David to start answering, and then maybe we might go to Kirsten next.
Yeah, so adolescents and young adults are such an important topic. Once you move out of the paediatric cancer system into the adult cancer system, you not only go from perhaps one major centre per state to potentially dozens, maybe even hundreds of smaller institutions. But those institutions tend to have an older population with cancer in them. So it's quite common for a young person with cancer to find themselves in a ward surrounded by nobody under the age of 60, which creates a very alienating experience at a very frightening time. And young people are actually sort of incredibly important, I think, because the ripple effect around young people and their families is massive, and their lifespans that are foregone in that population, even though the numbers are relatively small, is absolutely, disproportionately large. I think we need to tailor our systems in a more patient-centered fashion to acknowledge that one size doesn't fit all, and I think particularly that boundary between these two artificial historical pediatric and adult systems is a part of the solution to that. It's a complicated question.
Kirsten and Amanda, did you want to add some thoughts there about people transitioning through the system?
I think there's three key areas we need to help any patient, but in particular adolescents and young people, and that is around information, and that is supplying information in a whole lot of different ways so that we're delivering it to them at the time and the place and the way that they want it delivered to them. Then there's connection. We absolutely know that if someone has been diagnosed or affected by cancer, so not just the person diagnosed, but their family members, they need to be able to connect with other people and to feel a sense that they're not alone and to learn from their experiences. And then definitely, particularly in that young and adolescence area, we must give them a voice because they want to be able to share their experiences so that no one else has to go through some of the challenges that they've been through. So I think if we can really make sure that our information is right and has a good evidence base, but is delivered in a much more effective way than we currently have, then we will find a much better way for those people to navigate what is a really complex system. And I think people who work in the healthcare system every day forget how complex it is to navigate the system, to know whether they can access supportive care outside of the healthcare system, where those supportive care systems are really hard to find. And nothing makes a patient more angry than to find out that there was a program or a service that they had available to them that they don't find out until afterwards. So we have to make those connections of information, of connection, and giving people a voice through their whole experience.
Thank you. And Amanda, I might just get you to reflect as well. Is that something that's come through in your experience with people navigating the system?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on some things, just expand a little bit on what Kirsten said. So from the patients that we've spoken to, a lot of them, their parents have to navigate their treatment pathways, and a lot of the time there are other children involved. So we don't even think about the children that aren't being treated with the cancer but are the siblings. And there's a lack of support for those those other children within the family. And there's also a lot of stress on the parents. Sometimes one or both have to stop working because of the demands of travelling just even within Australia, if not overseas, to get the right treatment for their child. So we really need to think about practically how we can support these families and how we can support the extended members of a child's family network.
Thank you. Now we've got a question from Mark from Hornsby, and this one might be good for Michael and maybe David and maybe Bruce as well. Given the focus on targeted and immunotherapies and these amazing new treatments we're hearing about, what role do you think the chemotherapy and radiotherapy might have in treating cancer in 2030? So let's start with Michael.
For some of the cancers that I treat, chemotherapy and radiotherapy actually sets a very high bar to be beaten. I mean, as an experience, many patients tell me they don't enjoy chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Of course, it can be tough more often than not. But for some of the lymphomas I treat, it's curative in the vast majority of cases, and patients can have fixed course treatment and then move on with the rest of their lives, which is, of course, what we all hope for as a doctor. So I think chemotherapy and radiotherapy is going to be around for a while longer yet, and that these new therapies have to have that goal. A lot of the new therapies that we see come out, and this is where I think industry has to be responsible in the design of its clinical trials and its new therapies. Please take this novel therapy forever until it stops working. That's not a great model of health. I mean, what's health? It's fixing the problem and then coming off treatment and not having side effects from the treatment or the problem. Chemotherapy and radiotherapy actually allows that for many of the lymphomas that I treat in particular, and leukemias. Not for all cancers, of course, but for many of them. So I think that the new treatments we have to meet that goal as well. And unfortunately, some of the new treatments we see have been developed in a way where the companies aren't testing the question of stopping the treatment. Because I think the best model of health is being cancer-free and off treatment.
Treatment-free. Well, maybe. Thank you, Michael. Bruce, did you want to respond to that about both things really? The issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the evidence drives you to where you should use therapies, and if the standard of care and the best results come from chemotherapy or radiotherapy, then that's what should be used. I think one of the dilemmas with the new treatments is that the world's looking for them earlier, so you're getting earlier and earlier phase results, and I think there's a role to play if we want to get cancer treatments out there earlier. There's a big role, and I think Amanda's mentioned it, there's a big role in terms of how do you then use technology to track the data and answer that question over time as to what is the ideal duration of that treatment.
David, did you want to have an input into that question as well?
Yeah, and it's not just radiotherapy and chemotherapy, it's surgery. We forget that this hundreds of year-old technology still cures the majority of solid cancers today. And so, if we go back to 1970, we've got short memories. Survival from cancer was 25%. It's now 69% in Australia, and that's been largely as a consequence of the methodical science trials-led introduction of new technologies, at that time including chemotherapy, surgery and radiotherapy. This is simply a logical next phase. We've broken through and started to incorporate science rather than what we call empiricism, which is where you don't know why a drug works, you just know that it works. We now are designing drugs so that we know why they will work, and that hopefully will accelerate the pace of the progress that we've already had using these older technologies.
So we've got quite a specific question about getting drugs on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and I might get Amanda and maybe to answer this one, or maybe Kirsten, just more generally about getting access to drugs. It's a woman who's written in with endometrial cancer. She's on Coiera at the moment, which is an immunotherapy. It's not free, and she's paying a lot of money at the moment, but it's considered her best option. And there's other drugs that have been listed on the PBS, like Lynparza and things like that. And she's asking, what can people do who can't afford a drug like Coiera? What would you say to people in those sort of situations, Amanda, which is a difficult situation for a patient to be in, obviously?
It is a very difficult situation, and that's why we have organisations like Rare Cancers Australia who have patient support teams led by my very good colleague Kirsten that you saw earlier today, that help patients to try and navigate difficult treatment pathways when they can't access therapies that they may need. It's a very difficult dilemma because it is on the onus of the manufacturer or the sponsor company who has conducted the research and the clinical trial to put in the application to first get the drug registered through the Therapeutics Goods Administration, which means then it's freely available to be used for the approved indication. But then the next step is getting reimbursement and listing on the PBS for that particular therapy. And as we all heard, that can take time, depends what the evidence base is, depends who has been trialled within the trial as to which type of cancer it's going to be available for, just to put it simply, and whether that therapy is cost effective. There are so many parameters. So as a patient wanting to get access to a therapy that's not PBS listed, it's really very difficult. And sometimes companies do have compassionate access programs, but these are often limited in their duration, and they are for a very sort of discrete group of patients. So the best thing to do is to contact a group like Rare Cancers Australia, where we can support you, and we have connections with physicians and companies, and we do directly approach companies. But there is no sort of solid fix over blanket answer to solve that problem.
So before we move on, we just did have another question about Keytruda, which might be one for David to answer, and it was about the fact that Keytruda had been approved in the United States. I'm not sure if you are across that and whether that's ever likely to happen in Australia. That was the questioner was asking.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, Sophie, is the pan-cancer approvals for Keytruda or pembrolizumab, this wonderful new class of checkpoint inhibitors across all cancers, which share either what's called mismatch repair deficiency, which is one biomarker that's genetic, or high tumor mutational burden, which is another genetic biomarker. In order for those sorts of approaches to work in Australia, there has to be assumed access to the test. Otherwise, how would you know who's got a...
So you need to be able to know what sort of tumour someone has and the genetic markers before you know if they're eligible.
You've got to be able to treat it almost like we would today a diagnostic report that we assume exists for our cancers when our doctors treat us today. And so the question is, how do we do that? And that's one of the reasons why universal access is so key. We talk about this link between MSAC and PBAC. Why not cut the Gordian knot? Just make it universally accessible so that MSAC is entirely to one side. It's assumed that you can get access to this technology. And then the question is entirely about the drug and its utility, not about whether we have to also pay for a test, because that has become part of routine care.
While we've got you, David, we've got another question from Tim in Melbourne's asking, can you talk through the expansion of the MOST trial, I assume that is, the MOST trial into blood cancers into a second version of it? Is this the MOST-LLY? Can you explain what that means? I'm sure some of the audience will, but some of the audience won't.
Yes, so MOST is the most organic program I've ever led. So we started off with a pan-cancer approach, but we soon realized that lots of experts like Michael in the area of hematologic cancers were saying, well, why don't we have a similar program for blood cancers? There's no reason why somebody dying from a solid organ cancer should be any different from the point of view of the experimental approach from somebody with a liquid cancer. And I showed you, I think, in my slides that we've done this. We've created sub-programs led by experts in lung cancers. So we have a sub-program in lung cancers, mostly is MOST leukemia lymphoma, LLY. And it's being led by a whole host of experts like Michael, who are running programs for their patients using the principle of molecular screening and then matching that to the right drugs. And, it's lovely to see the engagement with the community, because I think that's how we get these approaches to patients who need them.
Michael, given you're involved with this, did you want to add anything before we move on?
Oh, well, I think there are a number of programs that look at genomic testing in leukemia and lymphoma. And I guess that one of the biggest challenges, and it's a theme that David's spoken to several times today and that you've asked specifically about, this equity of access question isn't just about the cost of a drug. It's also that a patient living in Melbourne or in a part of Melbourne or in Townsville or something can get equivalent access to these tests. So there's good testing programs in leukemia and lymphoma in Melbourne that are available at several hospitals, but they're not available routinely you need to know to ask, and your haematologist needs to know to ask. And equity of access is also about equity of knowledge. So does the oncologist who's looking after you or the haematologist who's looking after you reach out to see if this testing program is available, which might be being done on a research basis, might be speculative, might not have proven evidence, but may well be available just down the road if you just go and get the test down the road. And I think one of the big challenges for equity of access is this equity of knowledge thing, knowing that these programs are going on and making sure that it doesn't matter which haematologist or oncologist you go to, they know the test is available, they can advise you whether it's the right thing to get done, and you get a sense that wherever you go, you can access these novel diagnostic measures or the novel treatments.
Well, that's perfect for our next question, Michael, which is about some of the variations in access to treatment. And Rosanna from Wollongong has asked, she said, well done on this report, but she talks about the variation in cancer rates and outcomes, particularly for Indigenous people, lower socioeconomic groups, poorer groups and specific tumour types. And she's asking, how does this Vision 2030 address the urgent need to close these gaps? So maybe Michael, if you wanted to answer, or also, and maybe we can get Amanda after that.
Well, I think there's something not terribly sexy about teletrials and Zoom. You know, we're all a bit sick of it.
Zoom fatigue is real.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult, right? And I wouldn't pretend like telemedicine is the answer to all equity issues. But what I would say is that the experience of COVID-19 over the last couple of months has really increased how many patients can communicate with me about therapies that we're providing in my hospital from afar. And they can still see their local oncologists, still have care locally, but just check in to make sure that there isn't some trial that is pertinent to them or some test that is pertinent to their disease. And the telemedicine approach has really broken down borders. I mean, one of the special things about Australia is states. You know, we have states and they have different healthcare systems. That's great. It allows for competition and different visions and different models. But it's also a barrier for accessing treatment. And then there's the regional city divide. And I don't think telemedicine is the solution to everything. But it really has been exciting that measures that the government put in place very quickly around COVID-19 actually immediately improved the care I was able to provide to regional patients. And now that's become very routine, and it was kind of there and latent before. But it's a very exciting way to take things forward, and I think that's been captured in this report. And I think it's been what's been great is how easy it was once it was switched on. It was really easy.
Can I add to that, Michael? What we did find, BCNA did a survey after that first kind of lockdown, and sadly, what we saw is that the great clinicians were using telehealth in a fantastic way, but the ones who weren't, who were picking up the phone, who were diagnosing people over the phone without any support in place, were not connecting to them visually, but only by phone. So we've got to make sure that we look after the system to put things in place so that the experience is the best. Because what I find constantly is the very best clinicians are always the ones at the table. And they're the ones we've got to worry least about, because patients who are further away, who are not connected, whose clinician will never know that there's a compassionate access program in place, they're the ones that we must worry about the most. And so whatever we do, and telehealth is fantastic, many silver linings, we must put good parameters in place to bring the worst of the clinicians up.
Yes.
Well, equity of knowledge is not just about patient knowledge,
Correct.
which is the priority, but it's also about clinician knowledge and skills.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. And Amanda, I might just go to you briefly to cover that, to speak to the question about the equity issues. What does the report say about how you can address that leading up to 2030?
Thanks, Sophie. Look, I think this is where the framework comes in, and it's really the whole premise behind the framework is really, keep using the word integration, but it's not just integration at a patient level. It is about connecting physicians, connecting them with knowledge, being able to share best practices. reaching rural and remote communities through telehealth is, one of the aims of the second pillar. But there's a lot of work to be done underneath the layer of that, and that includes connecting the physician community, but also potentially around literacy from a technology perspective. We don't know how easy or how difficult it is for people in those rural and remote communities to actually use this technology. We know we're able to use it, but can they use it effectively? So there needs to be work done in that area. We need to understand what the need is, and then we need to meet that need.
So I just wanted to go back to something that David mentioned earlier about the uptake of clinical trials, and we did have a question about how can we better engage people to take part in clinical trials? So I might ask you, David, and maybe Bruce as well, given that's an issue that, for the pharmaceutical industry as well. How do we get people to take part, given that, we need the numbers to get the findings so that people will take notice of them?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Historically, I guess, we've thought about science as experimenting, the human guinea pig. And when you look at those phase 1 response rates of 5%, I think all of us as clinicians have felt for many of my personal years, I guess, that phase 1 trials are last option. But that game's fundamentally flipped, I think. And this is another example where I think the realization of the potential value of this breakthrough in science is as much about the system rather than something fundamental to do. It's about teletrials. It's about the way the system organizes itself and rethinks the way it interacts almost across every domain, from between public and the private sector, between the costs that we pay for drugs that cost $1 billion to develop. If only we could change the elements of the system that cause those costs to fall upon our industry partners by perhaps a more collaborative, integrated approach in which governments and industry work together to get the drugs faster to the patients that need it for a better price. And that's surely as much about the system as it is about molecules and DNA and medicinal chemistry and structural biology. That to me is the fascinating things. Really great breakthroughs have this corrosive effect upon old structures and force change. Look at COVID. We just talked about COVID challenging the system and all the good things that flow from really adapting to it. Adaptation comes out of crisis, I think. And in some ways, I think we're in a position of wonderful potentiality, I think, right now as a consequence of where we stand. And it's only a question of our energy and releasing our energy to tackle it.
And Bruce, from your point of view, from an industry point of view, what could be done to really get more people to be involved in clinical trials, so that we can get the key numbers we need to make a difference to get people in these clinical trials?
Firstly, I would say by global standards, Australia has a significant clinical trials footprint. So there is actually quite a significant use of clinical trials in this country relative to its size, and that's largely because of the high value that the investigators are able to deliver here in clinical trials. And I think it also speaks quite optimistically to the ability of those investigators in the system to be able to have a good conversation with patients about enrolling in trials. So I'm not actually highlighting this as a major issue for the industry, but it is something that I think in some cases, people aren't aware there's a trial going on, and there is effort to be made in that space. And I think Rare Cancers actually has an approach to that, a portal that people can go to, right? So it's those types of things that are quite helpful.
That's good. Now we've got a question from Peter from Tweed Heads, who's asked, what's the panel's view about the future role of theranostics, which is a targeted version of radiotherapy? So who would like to speak to that? Michael or David, or who would like to talk about that? Michael?
It's outside of my disease specialty.
David?
But we've certainly seen, particularly in prostate cancer, that you can image the distribution of disease in a patient. So theranostics is basically the idea of diagnostics and therapy in one modality. So that's what the word refers to. And the example is what we call radioimmunotherapy. So using a label that can be picked up on in imaging, but also provides radiation to the tumour. And we've been doing that for years in lymphoma, years and years in lymphoma. But where it's proving to be really tractable is in the urogenital tumours, where we've seen some really stunning responses in patients who have hormone refractory or chemo refractory metastatic tumours, where really effective responses and durable responses have been seen using a modality that essentially delivers localised, essentially radiation to the tumours through this theranostics approach. I think it's got huge potential. I think it's one of the most promising breakthroughs, but it's all about having a very specific target with the label that's being used. So not all cancers lend themselves to this approach, but some clearly do, and that's been very exciting. And Australia has actually been very heavily involved in developing this, which is exciting to see too.
And so we might just ask you, Enrico, with your focus on AI, what do you think? I mean, you talked about it a little bit in your talk, but for the lay audience, what can they expect in the next couple of years that we'll see with AI offering, particularly when it comes to either cancer diagnosis? Is that going to be the key, diagnosing tumours using a combination of the AI's ability along with the best clinicians?
Yeah, so I think 5 years ago people were talking about AI replacing radiologists, and what's been really exciting is to look at, say, what's happened in Australia with the College of Radiology, which is really a world leader in thinking about the role of these technologies in their profession, and they've really transformed their attitude to embrace it and to recognise that essentially we're talking about not machines doing things, but machines plus people being better than either one alone. And so I think that's the model that we're going to see going forward, at least in the imaging professions. I don't think you're going to see huge pervasive application of AI in the next 2 to 3 years, simply because we're just a little bit early in that curve. But I do expect it to sort of be behind the scenes in any complex imaging in the next decade for sure. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I might just ask Kirsten, maybe Michael and David, how open do you think patients and clinicians are to incorporating something like AI into cancer diagnosis and treatment?
Well, one thing I can say is happening right now is that in our molecular tumour board, which is where all these tests come in and clinicians sit around and scientists sit around trying to work out what is in the best interest of the patient. That process is remarkably, multidisciplinary and organic. And it's a perfect environment, given that the data is relatively structured to apply AI to help with what's called clinical decision making. And I think that's, I can tell you, having sat on lots of molecular tumour boards over the past 3 or 4 years, having any help to get the best outcome for the patient that's in front of you by using artificial intelligence to extract the maximum value from the data points you have in front of you is absolutely, it's going to be part of clinical practice for sure. It is part of clinical practice.
Fantastic. Now. And maybe Kirsten, your view, what do you think in terms of patients and clinicians, whether they're open to using AI and having that as part of, standard treatment, hopefully in the future?
Look, I think patients want to have the best possible outcomes for themselves. So anything that we can prove to them and really demonstrate the benefits will be loved and opened. And it's a bit like this whole idea around patients not wanting to let go of their information. I think the MyGov records clearly send a message to us that Australians are happy if they have a trusted source or a trusted place to give their information away, if it means they're going to have a better outcome, if they're not going to have to tell their story a million times. So anywhere where we can demonstrate to people that there is evidence behind it, have good influence by not just those people who may benefit from it financially, but from patient groups where we understand and can translate the technical information into easy English for people to understand, then people will take organisations like Rare Cancer Australia, like BCNA, like the Cancer Councils, and they will take that information and believe in it and really support it. And I think that's why consumer groups are so integral in any future that we are delivering, because we play a really important part about being that trusted source of information for all Australians who do want a better outcome for themselves.
So we've got a few more questions. I want to get through as many as we can before we finish. We've got a question from Barry, which might be a good one for Amanda. And we've just mentioned, they want to be more clinical trials, but with rare cancers, like particularly like the brain cancer that we heard of the little patient earlier, there are just not enough patients or tumours to have a clinical trial for, if it's a rare cancer. How do we fix that? And what's some of the things that the report has highlighted as ways to fix that?
Well, I think, Sophie, we still do have clinical trials in some of those populations, but they're earlier phase research, so they're not the sort of standardised randomised controlled trials that recruit hundreds of patients. They're single-arm studies. I think either Bruce or David referred to that before. So it's early evidence. So it's either what's known as usually phase 2 evidence, and you can have, 10 or less patients. Another way to deal with small patient populations is to have obviously global trials and sharing of information, sharing of clinical trial results through data registries and data repositories, such as a National Cancers database that we were talking about before,
which would be amazing.
Data Commons, that's it, the Data Commons,
exactly.
Thank you.
So having that all the information put together of all, in one central place would make a massive difference, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
We've got another question I think is important. They're all important, so we want to try to get through as many as we can. And Hayley's asking, what are the key barriers? This is an amazing report, but what are the barriers to making this framework happen, and how do we address that? So how do we sort of identify the barriers to these pillars that you've identified, and then address those barriers? So Amanda, did you want to pick that up, and then maybe might go to David as well? How do we identify the barriers that might be in place, whether it's the system or reticence, and then think about ways around that?
Well, I think it depends which pillar of the system, which pillar of the framework that you're looking at, but there are going to be inherent barriers in all parts of, embarking on something new. But a way to overcome this is what we're doing today, is getting the right people in the room to have the discussions, doing the research, and having those collaborations where you have as much of a united view as you possibly can to take this forward in the interests of patients.
That's a good point, and we might go to Bruce actually, because we've got the industry with us as well. So, what do you see as any key barriers that might be, or roadblocks that might be there, and how do we overcome those barriers to getting this report put into action?
I think one barrier is the kind of framework that we today have our own biases in place. So for example, we're talking about next generation sequencing, for example, as if it's something to come in the future, and we have to be talking about it as this generation sequencing, and I think be prepared in an industry, in a sector that requires a lot of evidence, that sometimes we just need to step back and say, well, we don't have the evidence, but it's obvious to go this direction. And I think when we're talking about some of the things that are proposed here, it should be obvious that it's advisable to do that. And of course, the barriers usually come back very much to fiscal barriers, but I'm really impressed with the report, because it goes out to 2030 and says, well, if we want this, what's the roadmap to get there? And I think that's exactly the right thing to do.
So Kirsten, we might go to you. What's your views on the road, the particular barriers and how we get over them?
I think there's some pretty simple and very fast steps we could make. One is that we were talking about clinical trials before. I mean, the reality is regional patients can't even get patient-assisted travel in Australia to get to a clinical trial meeting. That could be immediately dealt with by the states. And I was very pleased out of State of the Nation that Queensland quickly made some reform in that area. But every other state can do that today. Just add on to programs to allow patients who want to participate in clinical trials to be able to have their travel scheme. It's a pretty small amount that they're compensated. But the other is that when we have a really great drug that seems to be coming through, which we know is going to be held up in our system, then let's have those compassionate access schemes open quickly to everyone who is eligible for it. And that's a real role that I think the pharmaceutical industry must play in opening up those compassionate access programs, so we don't have these big bills that people still have to pay just to get onto the program. But and it is an opportunity for us to be able to gather some real-time data as well by getting people onto the access program quickly. It means we can keep dealing with that real-time data and make the adequate change. But there is also one area that's always of concern for me, and that is we always want to invest in the new. And there are some real opportunities for us to look at the old and how we might be able to, make it more effective for a wider group of people. And I think we really need to make sure that we're not just looking at the new great drug that's coming through, but also what have been some of the really effective treatments we've had that can widen out, like we were talking to before, to benefit other patients. And it's not going to be as costly for the government or for the system to be able to do that. So there are some pretty quick wins we can make while we look at the much bigger system problems that we've got that'll take some more years to come.
So we've only got about 5 minutes left, and so what I want to do now is I want to go around to the panel, to each of you, and get you to answer this question. What do you think is the most important step that you want to see happen to see that this report succeeds? So what's the most important step that you would like to see happen? We'll start in Melbourne with Amanda. What's the most important step that you would like to see?
Thanks, Sophie. I'd really like to see people embrace the framework and get involved with the work that we've started and really action it and take it forward. I'm hoping we've had a bit of discussion around financial barriers today and cost, and I think one of the biggest issues is always around how we're going to pay for it. And I think a way of dealing with that is looking at, as I said before, cost as an investment, and we can actually measure that in different ways. And one of the flaws of our system, is if you like, is that we cannot currently incorporate societal returns on investment. And what it means when someone's healthy and they can go back to work, and the flow and effects for a family who doesn't have to deal with a cancer death that affects them for the rest of their lives. So that's what I would like to see embraced as we move forward.
Okay, and so now briefly we'll go to Michael and then Kirsten.
I think there's been a lot of emphasis on new treatments as well, and I like that. That's where I think we're going to see progress, and I think the diagnostics will see progress. But I do think that we do have a problem in Australia with different states having different approaches and putting up different barriers and having to renegotiate all elements of any framework that involves improving.
So you'd like to see it a bit more united and a united
I'd like to see a united approach. And I'd like to see us, I think the lowest hanging fruit is to look at key elements that are currently not well supported. We don't have good registries for a lot of cancers. We don't have good data sets. We've talked about telehealth as being relatively low hanging fruit. So I'd like to see those low hanging fruit things us go straight for those. But then I also think we need some kind of program that addresses things like patient travel that could really improve life for patients very, very quickly. The problem is that you have to negotiate with every single state, and that's a challenge.
Okay, Kirsten, we might go to you for your key step that you'd like to see happen to make this report a reality.
Every good organisation, when they look at their strategic plan, kind of goes, what would we do differently if we started from scratch? And I think we've overcomplicated our healthcare system so much that actually I would like us just to take a step back. We know what the ultimate game is. So how do we make our, the state versus the federal, this infighting that constantly happens? I do think we need to step back and say, if we were starting again, would we set the system up in a federated model? Probably not. So how can we look at ways where we can really overcome these big barriers we have in Australia because of the way we've set up our institutions like PBAC, MSAC, TGA, just overcomplicating things constantly rather than looking for a simpler approach.
Okay, thank you. We might just ask the panel in Sydney the same question. So Enrico, what is the most important step that you would like to see taken to ensure that the goals of this report become a reality for 2030?
So I think the AI world is still new to the world of cancer, so success really for me looks like having us in that room when you flesh out the plan and make sure that we help you get where you want to go.
Then I'm going to be sneaky and move on to Bruce and not go in order. So Bruce, what's the most important step that you would like to see?
Yeah, it's equity of access. It's the way that value is assessed in the system, I think needs to be modernised. That would be the number one thing. And then looking at how do you get the money in there to pay for it.
Okay, David, we'll finish with you. Just that last question, the most important step that you think needs to happen for this report to become a reality.
Well, so at one level, I think it's about looking at the system itself, and the key controller of the system, the bottleneck or the lever is clearly with government. Government leadership can change the way in which this is looked at nationally. But then I also think we need to get very paramilitary, tactical, and I think the tactical weakness in this space, the opportunity lies in genomics. Universal coverage for all Australians with genomics has a whole lot of downstream consequences which will lead to the outcomes that we want.
All right, thank you. And look, thank you everyone for the open discussion, the expertise and the experiences that were shared here today. It's been really insightful and amazing to hear all these, a great plan for the future. Before we leave, we're going to play a final video to officially launch the Vision 2030 report, which you can all download after the event. So thanks for having me here today, and I look forward to seeing this landmark plan being put into action. And thank you for taking the time to join us today.
When Annabelle got diagnosed, we were given no options. We were told, your child is going to die. We talk about this tumour in months. There is no treatment. We didn't accept that as an answer. We literally travelled the globe trying to find any treatment options for Annabelle. There was nothing here. We were lucky that we had a lot of community support, but we wouldn't have survived without that. We did find other options overseas. They did provide Annabelle with great quality of life, and they did extend her life. We were told we had a few months, and we got her for 2 years.
The experience of Kathy and her family does not have to be a continuing, repeating thing.
Every cancer is as unique as you are. And we never understood that, and we never understood how to treat it. But now, through the genius of genomic science, we can understand what makes you unique as a person and what makes you unique as a patient. And then we can tailor the care and the treatment to you as an individual.
We really can look forward to a time where major improvements in disease control and survival will clearly happen, because the early studies already show that we can double survival in the right circumstances.
If we don't think about the future and we don't think about what's coming, then we won't be able to include these new treatments and therapies into our everyday health system. They'll remain the preserve of either the rich, or they'll sit within research institutes and they'll never make it out to mainstream cancer care. So we need a framework that looks at them, looks at our health system, looks at our aspirations as a society, and puts that together and says, this is how we take these wonderful treatments forward.
For anyone who's been diagnosed with a rare cancer or not given any hope, always keep hope, because you never know what's around the corner.
It's not unrealistic for us to expect that every cancer patient will have a 90% plus chance of survival over the next 10 years. But this will only be realised if we act now to build a system that addresses the gaps that will emerge as these new technologies come on stream. So we can save lives of cancer patients, both young and old, over the next decade to 2030 and beyond.